In Mexico, it's structured corruption. There was a system that Guzman's organization had put together where they were bringing in 10-ton loads under the guise of importing cans of jalapenos. The thing that changed the importation dynamic was the passage of NAFTA. They decided, you know what? We're not going to bring these 10-ton loads anymore unless there's a crooked border guard. I knew one guy that paid $1 million to get 2 trucks waved through.
If you don't mind, and I know you have some things going on with actually your life story right now, so we can't dive too deep into you, but give us the kind of 10-cent tour of why you are so knowledgeable at this.
Well, I'm from Los Angeles, and I'm Latino, and I was recruited at a very early age. Like I said, the first full year of the Cartel's operations was in 1990. I was brought on board in February that year. And so, and initially, the year before, me and my friends, high school buddies, had gotten involved in distributing ecstasy. A bunch of 19-year-olds selling ecstasy pills at nightclubs, parties, and, underground clubs. And one of the individuals in my circle had a connection for someone who was involved in what the government characterizes as a trade-based money laundering scheme. And essentially, at the time, Sinaloa, along with most of the Mexican operations, were still subordinate to the Colombians. You had product coming from Colombia to Mexico, getting taken into the United States, and then delivered to the Colombians. This was this is when the first American-based distribution networks for the Mexicans were just beginning to develop. Well, the Mexican guys had to get the money back to Colombia. Now, getting money to Mexico is very simple. You just put, $2-3 million in a trunk of a car, drive a Toyota Camry to the border, and someone will take the car and drive it across the border. Just bulk cash transports is what it's legally referred to.
Now, when that happens, do you guys have people on take at the border to get across, or is it?
No, look, it's a distributed network. The organization in Los Angeles is not the group that takes the money across the border. And so there were a handful of occasions where I actually participated in these, where I just drove the vehicle. There's you get to San Ysidro, just north of the border. There's a McDonald's right there, right before you cross the border. And you go to the McDonald's, and you're going to get met by an individual. You give him the keys. He takes the car. When he shows up, he gives you a dollar bill because that's your receipt. Because he has to present you with the dollar with the correct serial number. That way you can say, okay, I left LA with this number. I got the dollar bill with this number. I call my people. I got the money in it. I got the dollar bill in my hand, the receipt. That guy takes the car. Well, once I got the receipt, that other organization is responsible for the money. See, within the cartel structure, there's a concept called accountability. And when the money left, when the San Diego individual takes the car, accountability shifts to him. If he gets pulled over down the street, not my problem.
That dollar bill is your ticket out of your accountability. That's where your accountability is.
My accountability is now I can contact and say, I got the dollar bill. I'm waiting for the individual to take the car. He takes the car to a safe house in the area. They unload the money. They bring the car back.
So you already know ahead of time the serial number of what it's supposed to be when he gives it to you. That way, wow, that's interesting. That's cool.
And so, they take the money across the border. Now it's their job. Sometimes they'll have a group that just goes across the border. Other times they'll take it down to Guadalajara. See, the Sinaloa cartel is obviously from the Mexican state of Sinaloa, but for many decades, it was essentially ran out of the city of Guadalajara, which is in the next neighboring state of Jalisco. Guadalajara is a much bigger city. It's Mexico's second largest city. It's essentially take, Chicago, Phoenix, and Las Vegas, combine them.
Damn.
It's a big city. And so you're able to conceal your activity much better amongst a city population of 5 or 6 million, as opposed to Culiacan, which is 500,000.
Right.
Also, Guadalajara, since at least the 1970s, has been the money laundering capital of the Western Hemisphere, if not the world. And so that's one of the key strategic assets, because for many, many years, Sinaloa is receiving hundreds of millions of dollars a month, billions of dollars a year, but this is all in cash. Now, things have changed in the last few years with the advent of Chinese underground banking systems, But
Mhm.
prior to the Chinese having gotten involved, it was either bulk cash transports to get the money down to Mexico or trade-based money laundering. Well, trade-based money laundering is what the Mexicans were doing in the early 90s to get money down to Colombia because the Colombian banking system was under such high-level scrutiny from the Americans. So any American doing business with the Colombian was subjecting himself to unnecessary scrutiny.
Okay.
And so,
I know we kind of got off from like where you eventually did get arrested, but I wanted to, what is trade based banking? What is that? Can you explain that real quick?
well, in summary, it's if you have dollars in Los Angeles, there are individual businessmen in South America that want to use those dollars to purchase American goods.
Okay.
And so there are brokers in every country in South America who go to businessmen and say, hey, like in my case, it was heavy industrial grade equipment. So if you're looking to buy Caterpillars, if you're looking to buy tractors, if you're looking to buy water trucks, well, there are incentives to doing so. First of all, you're going to get a more favorable exchange rate.
Right.
Secondly, you're going to be able to act privately because the banks in your particular country doesn't know there's no financial transaction that anybody can monitor.
And you're buying high dollar pieces of equipment. I mean, those are $250,000, $500,000 machines. So,
Certainly, of course. And that means you're going to have to pay tariffs. Well, part of the operation was what's called essentially two sets of receipts. So if you pay in $1990 $500,000 for a Caterpillar earth mover, well, on paper you paid 110 grand because in Brazil there's a 40% tariff. So you want to be able to lowball the number.
right. I
So
see.
now that a piece of equipment gets to Brazil, you're lowering the tariff. The government doesn't know about the transaction. So they don't know how much you actually sent the money because the money never transfers. The South American doesn't give the money to the American. The South American gives the money to a Colombian. So American dollars in Los Angeles purchase goods primarily in LA and ship it to South America. South America in the heavy industrial equipment space, Argentina, Chile, huge mining interests. Venezuela, one of the largest oil deposits in the world. Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, huge farming interests. Well, they needed American heavy industrial equipment. Now, where I got roped into it was a Mexican American in Los Angeles who speaks Spanish can speak to a businessman in Argentina, Venezuela, Peru, it doesn't matter, but they all speak Spanish. The largest market in South America is Brazil. Well, Brazil was never a Spanish colony, it was a Portuguese colony, which is why my native language is Portuguese. And so they needed to find someone who was available to come into the office to essentially do the translating. And so whenever the business brokers operating in South America came across a Brazilian, they'd call me into the office.
Okay.
So by the time, so here I was, a 20-year-old guy meeting the guys that were quite frankly,
Running the
high up,
show. Yeah.
because the people that are entrusted with the responsibility are the individuals handling the money.
Yeah. It's not the
Any
guy.
any torpedo can handle the product.
Yeah.
The people that are trusted are the guys with the money. And so when you become acquainted with that individual, they just all call me Brazil. And so now whenever I meet someone, oh, so-and-so, they're like, how in the hell do you know him? You know what I mean? You're a 21-year-old kid. You're dealing with this guy?
Yeah.
So
Well, that puts you on another playing field. Like you said, takes you from the street level aspect of it. And the corner guys, however you want to word it, to dealing with the real players, the guys that really matter.
yeah, the real player. And so like when one of my friends wanted to start getting product, the individual he introduced us to, well, he was a significant trafficker. This guy was getting 800, 900 kilo shipments at a time. And so it was that kind of a leap to, oh, you need some work? No problem. Let me introduce you to this guy. Well, the guy you're meeting with is picking up 3, 4, 5 million loads at a time. You know what I mean? So it eliminated a lot of the riffraff, if you will.
I mean, this is why I knew I was going to enjoy this conversation. Getting that many kilos in at one time. I mean, do you have a story or two you can throw our way of like how they were able to pull that off?
Well, for the first, let's say 90 through 95, it was essentially coming in bulk transports, just enormous shipments. There was a system that Guzman's organization had put together for the first 4 years essentially, where they were bringing in 8, 9, 10-ton loads under the guise of importing, Mexican food goods. Los Angeles is a predominantly Hispanic city,
Mm-hmm.
and there's thousands of little Mexican markets everywhere, and so they're importing items for that particular segment of the. These aren't stuff you're buying at your local Alpha Beta or Lucky's or whatever the hell it is,
Mm-hmm.
and so people didn't realize that, hey, this guy's bringing in. They had essentially cans of jalapenos, like the big cans. Remember, like when you were a kid and you had the big things of Play-Doh?
Mm-hmm.
Well, they were essentially filling those up with product and shipping in tons at a time. And the thing that changed the importation dynamic was essentially the passage of NAFTA, because NAFTA resulted in the integration of the American and Mexican economies to a degree that it allowed for essentially the free flow of commerce between the two countries.
And that was put in by Clinton, right?
That was
Bill?
put in by Clinton. Well, it was negotiated by Reagan and Bush,
Yep.
implemented by Clinton. Both parties got together to essentially screw over the American worker.
Yeah. And then
And
Trump ended it when he got in office.
yeah, and so when it took effect, it was a game changer, because one, the amount of traffic increased dramatically, and also, just a few months before, one of the guys that were the periphery of some of the people that I knew, there was a seizure at the border where it was 10 tons of material. And quite frankly, those kind of losses are unsustainable. And so at that point, there was a change where they decided, you know what? We're not going to bring these 10-ton loads anymore unless there's a crooked border guard.
Yeah.
Crooked border guards, they can wave it through. Like I knew one guy that paid $1 million to get 2 trucks waved through. Well, that's, you got the inside track.
Right.
Other than that, what they would do is they just started building fleets of vehicles. So you got like the Tijuana port of entry, there's 15,000 cars coming through every day. Well, what's the probability of the car getting searched? If you look at it, 8,000 kilos is 8 metric tons.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if a Toyota Camry has a hidden compartment that can hold 40 units, that's 200 cars. What's the probability of them finding one of those 200 cars in a sea of 15,000?
Yeah.
In fact, when Chapo Guzman was going to trial, the government had one of its star witnesses was like an accountant that handled Guzman's books. And when they were questioning him, he made a point of saying that they suffered a loss of 1 vehicle out of 100. Those are odds that would make any casino in Las Vegas have wet dreams.
Yeah, I can deal with that loss. I just always find it fascinating, the methods that's used. I mean, you see it a lot in movies and whatever about ways that they move it over. And I remember watching a documentary. I can't remember one time where I seen it. It may have been on that American Gangster series that they had out. But this one guy bought a sub on the black market and was using a sub to transport, like underwater. So, it's just the lengths that people will go to get high volume shipments over in one piece. It really knows no end.
The submarines are primarily coming out of Colombia to get into Mexico.
Who's building them?
The Colombians are. They build it right there.
The subs.
Yes.
Jesus.
I've been in prison with numerous guys that were on cruise with subs.
I only asked that because the company that I work for actually builds submarines for the U.S. Navy.
Oh, okay.
That's why I was kind of curious of who's building those over there.
Well, these are semi-submersibles.
Right. Yeah. Not going way, way down, but
yes,
down enough to not be seen by regular boats and stuff like that.
Yeah. So if they have if a Coast Guard helicopter goes overhead,
they're not going to see it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, they're not. They're riding the top essentially.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, you can't see it from a surface vessel, but from an aircraft,
okay. Okay. All right. I see what you're saying. Yeah, but still, if you're off on, I'm a welder by trade. So if you're off on your welding and it's not right up under there and that thing starts taking on water, you're taking a little trip to the bottom.
Sure. And those submarines are about $1 million a piece from what I gathered from talking to guys. And, that's a wild ride.
Yeah.
And, that's really, how can I say this? in the 1990s, things were really different because the Mexican military was so corrupt. And so the principal supplier of much of the product and issue in the conspiracies, in my case, was a kingpin named Armando Valencia.
Mhm.
And Valencia put together an operation along with two other individuals, one of whom was Ismael Zambada, the other was a man named Amado Carrillo. Well, those three men together had an operation that was bringing 30 tons a month. Like, it was such an enormous operation, and it was possible because they had their own air wing. Amado Carrillo was the famous kingpin who bought a fleet of 737s, gutted them, and turned them into cargo aircraft.
Jesus Christ.
And, so Zambada had the general in Sonora that was responsible for a base on the take. Whereas Carrillo had the general that in Mexico City, the Americans built this state-of-the-art radar system for the Mexican government to monitor aircraft entering their airspace.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the guy that oversaw the operation was on the take. So he's green-lighting in the 737s. They're landing at the airbase with the other guy that's on the take. You have literally uniformed military personnel guarding and unloading the aircraft. And then bringing it up, stationing it up at the border area, and then they're shooting cars. I mean, people like to focus on the tunnels, and yes, they're dramatic, but
Mm-hmm.
the tunnels were basically designed for bulk.
Mm-hmm.
The original product that really put them on the map, going back to the Guadalajara cartel, was essentially weed,
Right.
which is a entirely different operation because you're talking, tractor trailers to transport this.
Yes.
It's very difficult to get that through the border. That's where the tunnels came from. The other product is much more concealable.
Yeah. Well, and it's going to bring in a lot more money too.
And there's a lot more value also.
Yeah.
And so you didn't necessarily see too much of, the tunnels for the Colombian material. Now, was it used? Certainly, but that's because the Mexicans have a strategy where they want to stretch the American law enforcement community thin. And so, you hear a lot of today about, migrants bringing stuff over the border. Bullshit. Very little use of migrants. First of all, what are you going to have? 400 people all carry 2 units?
Yeah.
Like, how are you going to trust all these people not to run off with your product? You know what I mean? Like, it's now, do they do it every once in a while? Sure. Why? Because that way, whenever they see a caravan, they have to respond.
Yeah.
Okay. Another popular thing that they do now is they use catapults. There's a significant stretch of the border where Trump did, in fact, build a wall.
Right.
Well, here you got a 21st century technology, state-of-the-art technology, state-of-the-art sensors, state-of-the-art motion detectors, the best of American ingenuity. And so what Sinaloa and the new generation have done is they broke out 12th century technology in the form of catapults. And so they take catapults, put it on the back of trailers, drive out to, wherever they're going to drive for, and they'll just start launching bales over. Now, it's not illegal to have a catapult in Mexico. And so they have people driving up and down, parallel to the Rio Grande with catapults. They may be launching tomatoes. But the Border Patrol, every time they see one, they got to dispatch men.
So you stretch what they have thin until there's nobody left to respond.
You have thin. Yes. Okay. And so now, and so if you dispatch 6 catapults on a cloudless night, maybe one of them is going to be actually sending product over.
I got you.
Another thing that, right before I left prison, we got a guy from the new generation, and he was telling me about they just essentially have their own entire air wing. It's just all drone fleets. And so again, at nighttime, boop, you just got drones flying back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so by creating all of these alternatives, one, it stretches the American thin. And 2, it allows for them to concentrate on what needs to be concentrated on, which is principally the ports of entry. And until an American politician stands up and says, we're going to withdraw from NAFTA, or NAFTA 2.0 is now they're characterizing it, then it's essentially a waste of time. Because at the Port of Nuevo Laredo, you got 18,000 vehicles crossing every day. In Tijuana, you got 15,000 crossing every day.
I don't know if I was in that game, if I would want to be the guy like responsible for getting that load across, because if you lose a sizable load, this is a wild guess, but I'm guessing you're not going to be around to lose another one.
Yes, you would be held accountable for that loss because,
So does that come with a bigger payday, a bigger portion of proceeds, kickbacks? How does one get tasked with that job?
well, part of the misconception is that Sinaloa was a monolith. New Generation is a little bit different. They actually are vertically integrated. Sinaloa is horizontal based system where you've got groups that are essentially equal to one another. Like there's no one leader.
Right.
When for years they characterized Chapo Guzman as the leader. Well, that was never the case. He was in charge of his organization, and his organization was, of course, important, but he wasn't in any way dictating directions to other coordinate leaders.
Right.
And you don't have to, you can just look at the record. Guzman gets knocked off in 16, gets extradited to the U.S. at 17. Well, there's more product in 18 than in 17. Then
Yeah.
there's more product in 19 than in 18.
So he's not the one pulling all the strings by any
No,
stretch.
it's an amorphous entity that is constantly rebuilding. It's like a school of fish. There is no one leader. They just all move in unison.
Yeah.
And so now those organizations that geographically happen to be up against the American border, what's called the frontera, they're the ones who handle importation. Sinaloa is 1,000 miles from the border. It's not a border state. So they send the product up to the border, and there's going to be a group there, whether it's in Tecate, Mexicali, Tijuana, any one of the ports of entry. Every plaza is a separate port of entry. Well, whichever group's in charge of there, you're responsible. So if the individuals operating that particular plaza lose a 10-ton shipment, well, they're going to be called to account. And look, there's always going to be losses that you can't control.
Right.
But if they determine that it's due to incompetence on your part, then you'll be eliminated. In that world, there is no tolerance for incompetence. It's not like corporate America. It's not like here where you're going to get a lawsuit, you're going to get served. No. In that world, there's a filter. You lose a load, better have a damn good reason to be accountable for that loss.
Right.
And
there is no next time.
No. And so, look, if you have a 1% probability of losing, as illustrated by Guzman's trial, it's not really an issue. And since 94, they've really moved away from the 8, 9, 10-ton shipments. Now they just take it to the border and they'll send 200 cars.
Yeah.
Maybe 100 cars today, 100 cars tomorrow. They're done. That's 8 tons.
How much money do you think goes into paying off politicians, border guards, and everything? It's got to be a staggering amount of money that goes to paying off all these politicians and border guards and people that just look the other way. Military, probably people just look the other way or either help facilitate the operation.
Well, in Mexico, it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars because there it's essentially structured corruption.
Yeah.
The new governor takes over from the last governor, and his chief of staff's going to know this is who you talk to for your envelope. And in the military, the guy that's a general today was a colonel 6 years ago and was a captain 15 years ago. Well, they all got their envelopes. So they all know when they move up, they're going to be told, okay, this is your contact. And so this has just been going on. Like I said, the plaza system has been in place in its current formation since the 70s. The earlier formation was since the 20s. And so this is going on now for 100 years. In the United States, it's different because there isn't a culture of corruption. Now, are there individual officers that are dirty? Certainly. In my case, one of the main issues concerned there was a corrupt agent on the FBI's drug task force that was integrally involved in the events that culminated in the homicide that was at the center of my prosecution.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was more of a Whitey Bulger type situation. Well, that's very unusual within the American law enforcement community. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say I'm a big fan of law enforcement because, quite frankly, a lot of them will, fabricate evidence, but they fabricate evidence in the context of justifying probable cause on a search.
Yeah, I've had a little experience with that
You
myself.
know,
How they kind of stretch.
there's not a very big culture of taking money. You know, in the late 1990s, there was a major scandal in Los Angeles with the Rampart
Rampart.
scandal,
Yeah,
where it was essentially three cops.
yeah. What was that? Rafael Perez, was he the top guy in that
Yeah, I don't remember the name of the officer, but essentially the basis for the Denzel
training?
movie Training Day.
Yeah, yeah. I want to say Rafael Perez was one of the guys I know. I mean, they're even linked into possible connections to the slaying of Notorious B.I.G. You know, a prominent rapper
Sure.
back in the day. And I know you spent a long time in prison, and you've only been out what, about 6 months?
Yes.
I was stumbled on a show this past probably like 2 weeks ago, and I burned through it. It was called Cocaine Hotel. Have you heard of that or seen
Yeah.
that? So it's set like in Miami, and it's a Castro still in power. It's pretty much just a lot of, similar situations to what you're talking about of, drug dealing and then crooked cops and getting people over. And there's takings of family members and stuff like that. It's a pretty good show. But I love stuff that's set, in that time frame because it seems like back in those days, and I guess that would be before you kind of got heavily involved, but it was just a Wild West. And, just like everything else, time changes everything, business, sports. I mean, everything changes. But when you have the advent of even the criminal enterprise and how that changes, what was it like when you first got into it as opposed to now when you're out? Because you went away in what year?
I got taken into federal custody in '97.
So you were taken in 97. You just got out
Yep.
2024,
Yep.
and
Well, I was at the
obviously,
halfway house. So,
okay. So all right. So you were there in 2023.
yeah.
All right. And obviously I know you're not still tied into that, but I mean, you can research and see what's going on. What do you think is the biggest changes from then to now?
Well, the the two biggest changes that have fundamentally altered the market was the introduction of synthetics and the mistake the American government made was in targeting the Colombian distribution network in the United States. Because you have to understand, back in the 80s, that era that you were talking about, the Colombians had a monopoly. They
Mhm.
controlled production and they controlled distribution. Well, the fun, you know, the defining characteristic of a monopoly is they engage in anti-competitive business practices in order to keep the prices artificially high. So now, isn't that what our government would want? By keeping the prices artificially high, it's outside of the price. Most people can't afford it, which is
Yeah.
why in the early 1980s, you know, blow was essentially product that was consumed amongst the elite. The
Yeah.
bankers in New York celebrating at nightclubs in Manhattan, entertainment industry figures in LA partying at nightclubs in Beverly Hills. It was a status symbol.
Yeah. They even say that in the movie Blow. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to see that movie with Johnny Depp, but he portrays George Young, who
Okay.
was kind of a guy that got connected with Pablo Escobar. He was like, I don't know, I'm sure he wasn't the only one, but one of the key guys in the States connected straight dealing with Pablo. And
Okay.
he's like, that was kind of his product plan. He's like, if it's accepted by actors and musicians, everybody else will fall in line. And that
Okay.
was kind of you give it to those guys, they promote it, and then it kind of trickles down. So that was their blueprint of introducing
But
that to the United States.
there was really look. Back in the early '80s, they were generating 700 to 800% profit per unit.
Mhm.
So they had absolutely no incentive to flood the market. Had the DEA never, had Reagan not declared war on drugs in '82, you'd have never had the crack epidemic.
Yeah.
You would never have the development of what ultimately occurred. Because according to the DEA's own numbers, the Colombians were bringing in 48 tons a month. 48 tons a year. Now that may sound like a lot, but it breaks down to 4 tons a month. Well, 4 tons a month is for the entire United States. So when the
It's not a
South
lot
Florida
really when
task,
you look.
so when the South Florida Task Force was created in '82, we spent billions of dollars interdicting flights. Well, the Colombians didn't bring it to the United States. They took it to the DR, Dominican Republic. They took it to the Bahamas, and that's where American pilots would then pick up the material and fly it in. They're basically flying it in Cessnas, or
Yeah.
maybe a bigger operation like a, King Air would do two props. But essentially, there was small flights done in high frequency by American pilots. And so the South Florida Task Force brought in elements of the military. They had F-15s patrolling the Caribbean, AWACS, satellite technology, Coast Guard cutters, Navy vessels. So the amount of interceptions began to increase. So, within 2 years, the Colombians are losing 40 to 50% of their flights. You have Reagan administration officials making statements on background to the Washington Post, boasting that they had broken the back of the Colombian cartels. Well, when an individual from Harvard or Princeton or Yale makes that kind of a statement, talking about how he just outsmarted a guy with a second grade education, you know you're about to take it into shorts. Because you can expect the counterparty to engage in conduct to respond. So at that point, they were producing enough to send 4 tons every month to the U.S. Let's say their production capacity was at 4,500 units per month. Well, once you start losing 50% of your loads, what do they have to do? Scale up production. So now you've just encouraged the Colombians to triple up production. And in order to obviate your efforts in the South Florida Caribbean area, what did they do? They went looking for a new route. That's when they got into bed with the Mexicans. So by 85, just 3 years after commencement of the war on drugs, they had an alternate route with triple production. Before, they were bringing in 4 tons a month. Now they're bringing in 12 tons a month. Had the DEA done nothing, it would have been a more effective counter-narcotic strategy.
Right.
So now by 85, you've got 3 times the amount of product coming into the United States. What's happened? The price has plummeted. It's gone from $600 per gram in 1982 to now $300 per gram. Well, once you lower the price, it's much more accessible to a broader segment of the population.
Mm-hmm.
So as the amount of material starts coming into the United States, in order to not have it crater the price point, they decided to say, you know what, we need to figure out a way to sell this excess product without undermining our own markets. Now, Mario Villabona, the head of the Cali Cartel distribution cell, who, like I said, I got to know pretty well in prison, he was doing business with a handful of guys in Los Angeles, one of whom was an African-American named Michael Harris. Michael Harris went on to become legendary. He's known under the nickname Harry O. He was the trafficker who put up the money to bankroll Death Row Records. Well,
I've heard of that name. Yes.
Yeah. Mike and I are good friends. Well, Mike and a handful of other guys were very large traffickers within the African American community back in the 80s. Well, there were individuals at the lower end who had figured out a way how to market the material to the poor and lower middle class. What they did is diluted the quality of the material, taking 1 unit and turning it into 3. So it's much less valuable, so you can sell it at a cheaper price point, and they standardize the dosages. So now they're selling it for $10 or $20 per dose, as opposed to $300 or $400 a gram. So while the guy at the lower middle class or poor end of the spectrum may not be able to afford hundreds of dollars, he can come up with 10 or 20 bucks. And there's so many more of these prospective customers that in the aggregate, the market is much larger. And so what the Colombians said is, okay, well, we've got a way now to distribute this to the lower middle class and the poor, but we have to come up with a different marketing strategy, because what we don't want to do is have the people in Beverly Hills thinking they're doing the same product as the people in South Central. So they rebranded it and they called it crack. All of a sudden, you have an explosion in the market, because now that 12 tons, they can distribute it because they just created a much larger market. There's always been demand, but before they couldn't afford it. They're buying 12 packs of Budweiser. Now, all of a sudden, they can buy $10, $20, $50 rocks. So that 12 tons per month, they had to bump it up. Now it's 20 tons per month. Now it's 40 tons per month. By the time I get charged, 15 years into the drug war, I show up at the Federal Detention Center in 97, it's up to 80 tons a month.
Jesus.
They'd have been better off abolishing the DEA, taking all the hundreds of billions of dollars that were spent in interdiction, putting it in a football field and burning it. And you'd have had a more effective counter-narcotic strategy. And so the problems that were created, now they create this enormous problem. So the politicians go screaming to Congress and saying, hey, well, we need to be tough on crime. So they want to increase the penalties. This is where you get the 1986 amendments to the Controlled Substances Act.
Okay.
Well, anybody with an understanding of economics will tell you that was the worst thing you could possibly do. because price is a function of supply and demand and risk. Who benefits when the penalties get higher? Drug traffickers.
Mm-hmm.
They can command a premium. Every time you increase penalties in the United States, the Mexicans make more money.
Yep.
Every time you increase the sentencing guidelines, take away parole, you're giving them a raise. As far as the Mexicans are concerned, they don't care about the American distribution network. Give a first-time offender life. Who cares?
Yeah, they don't
Because
really care.
they're going to be able to command a premium. And so what happened was all of a sudden the amount of money coming in began to grow exponentially. And to really create the problem is the Americans said, okay, well, now we're going to target the Colombian distribution networks. They really messed things up on the interdiction side, on the supply side. Now they're going to affect the distribution. Well, they knock off a group in LA. They knock off a second group in LA. Mario Villabona gets knocked off in the 87, 88 time period. Well, by then, the Mexicans who had been working for 3 years, transporting the Colombian product into Southern California, had a change of heart and said, hey, we're no longer going to take your material and transport it for $1,000 per unit. We now want 40% of the load, 50% of the load.
They want to be paid in product.
They want to be paid in kind. Yes. Well, that was an enormous development because that created the basis for the Mexicans to begin developing their own American-based distribution networks. They were no longer logistics. They now had a distribution capacity, but they were flying below the radar.
Mm-hmm.
So the guys getting all the attention are the Colombians. So with the success of the DEA and the FBI targeting the Colombian distribution networks in the United States, they essentially gave the distribution market to the Mexicans. Now, why was that such a huge problem? Well, first of all, there's a lot more Mexicans than Colombians in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, when the Mexicans were transporting Colombian product, the Mexicans were the middlemen. They were logistics. The Colombians controlled supply and distribution. They had an incentive to keep the amount down. Well, once you take out the distribution side from the Colombians and give it to the Mexicans make their money on volume. So they're telling the Colombians, send as much product as you can send. The Colombians, having lost the distribution, they're no longer making $25,000 per unit. They're now making $5,000 per unit. So they've had a 75% drop in profits, but they haven't had a 75% drop in revenue, in obligations.
Right.
That judge in Colombia, he wants his envelope. The police chief, he wants his envelope. The politicians, they don't care if things are getting harder for you in the United States. They expect to get paid.
Mm-hmm.
So now you incentivize the Colombians to triple up production again to make up for the lost revenue.
I've never really thought of it like that.
Yeah. And so to answer your question, what the Mexicans did is they learned from watching the Colombians. And so, like, I watch a little bit of YouTube and I see some of these guys going on talking about how, they were dealing with cartel individuals. If you're a Caucasian, you're not talking to cartel. If you're a black guy, you're not talking to cartel. You may be talking to a Mexican.
Yeah.
And he may be posturing that he's cartel in order to create the impression, don't cross him, he's got people. But in reality, they assume every American, other than a Latino, who's first generation. If you're 3 or 4 generations here, you're just American.
Yeah.
You have to be first generation, raised in a home, because they know that you were trained by your parents, never trust the police.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that comes from those guys. That you did have some people, I think, years ago with the Colombians that were Caucasian. So like I said, George Young being one.
That was the mistake the Colombians made. They dealt directly with Americans. So when Villabona got knocked off, law enforcement was watching an African-American trafficker that went by the handle Waterhead Bo. Now, I know Bo from prison. Well, okay. They filed, the black guys in LA had too much exposure. Mm-hmm. So now they're watching the top dogs and they see him meeting with a Colombian. Well, Villabona's organization was, like I said, less than 10 people. If you're dealing directly with Americans, you're having too much exposure. The guy in Los Angeles that oversaw Zambada's distribution network was an individual named Herman Olivares. He had 3 people he dealt with, all Mexican nationals. He did not talk to Americans unless you were Latino and unless you were vouched for. And even then, you didn't deal with him.
Yeah.
You saw him at a cantina. Hey, what's going on, G? You know what I mean? Like there were very strict rules. And
Hmm.
so when no, and I see like American guys saying, "Why went down into Mexico to buy product? Why would you go to Mexico? It's an enormous risk.
Yeah.
You're going to undertake the risk of transporting the product from point A to point B. You're going to traverse all this land. You got no political protection, no law enforcement protection. You're going to
And
have to pay. You're the guy that gets set up.
yeah, and that's the last place you want to do is wind up in, a prison like that with no affiliation or no contacts.
No, yeah, of course. Look, it's enormously risky. You're better, from the trafficking perspective, you're always much better dealing with somebody in Los Angeles because the price in LA, although you're going to pay a little bit more, they assume all the risk.
Yeah.
And so, the changes in the market, just to finish off the earlier thought, it was those old time dons essentially who built organizations based on making their profit through volume have now kind of have been pushed off to the wayside or have passed away or are locked up to where this newer generation are making their money on synthetics. Well, the difference with synthetics are they don't have to rely on the Colombians for production.
Mhm.
They now control the production. They now control the distribution, and they haven't learned the lesson of awaking the slumbering giant. Because irrespective of whoever wins the next election, you're going to see some form of military action taken against the new generation.
Yeah.
Whether they can be designated terrorist organizations, or the new administration is going to threaten the Mexican government, saying we're going to designate them. So the Mexicans are going to say, hey, okay, well, look, embed your guys with our special forces as advisors, and we'll start attacking them. That's what they did with Pablo. That wasn't a Colombian operation. That was American led,
Yeah.
but they just camouflaged it by putting some Colombians out front, sort of remain sensible to their national pride. Well,
Right.
you're going to see that type of activity now because the profits in the synthetic realm are astronomical. And unfortunately for the American consumer, people are now, you hear stories about, the 22-year-old, he's at a party at a nightclub in Beverly Hills. He does a line, he drops dead.
Hmm.
The recreational user is now at risk.
Yeah. And that's bad.
Me, as a 19-year-old growing up, I actually was, fairly libertarian. Ayn Rand disciple. I was absolutely convinced that me as an adult, if I wanted to consume ecstasy, it was my business, nobody else's. And
Hmm.
so long as the product wasn't harming anybody else, that was their business.
Yeah.
Well, like I today in good conscience could not make that same position
Hmm.
because today you simply cannot attest to the quality of the material. In our case, several years, a couple of years into the operation, we got a chemistry professor from USC brought on board. He developed the formula for the production of pharmaceutical quality compounds. So we were actually making the material in hand. But to the
You hired
chemists,
a chemistry professor from USC.
yeah, that's ultimately what got us in quite a bit of trouble because there were very few groups producing product at scale with 100% purity level. And so you had essentially where three different task forces came together to form a strike force. And so after I got arrested, a few weeks later, here comes the FBI and the DEA, and they were trying to persuade me to cooperate. I refused to make any statements, but I had to sit in the room, listen to them, basically trying to cajole and then ultimately try to coerce me to cooperate. And one of the statements they made was that the mistake my friends and I made was that we had a signature in that every time there was a seizure, whether it was in San Francisco, Seattle, Honolulu, wherever there was a case involving MDMA at 100% purity, it always came back to Beverly Hills.
Hmm.
There at the time there wasn't too many large scale ice producing groups. Same thing. I got quite a few lab assessment reports, 100%, 100%, 100%, 100%.
So that was your unknown signature as the
That was the
percentage.
unknown signature. And that's where they were able to put that together because it all came back to the Beverly Hills section of West Los Angeles. And so you had essentially three different task forces. Like all the guys in San Francisco fell, they cooperated. All the guys in Honolulu fell, all but one cooperated. And all the guys in Orange County fell, they cooperated. Well, I was the first of the individuals in West Los Angeles. And so when they came to me, they were basically offering me, you know, essentially a get out of jail free package.
Mm-hmm.
Normally you'd be looking at a 30-year sentence, but there's like, we have information indicating that you dealt directly with Robles. They had intelligence indicating that I knew the Mexicans. Like at this point, they don't even know who the Mexicans are. They just know Mexicans.
Yeah.
They're like, they want Robles. They want the cartel level operatives. They want the name of the chemist that developed the formulas for the production of pharmaceutical quality compounds out of non-regulated chemicals. They wanted the name of the crooked agent. And me, out of a misguided sense of loyalty to some of my friends, turned down the opportunity to cooperate and spent 25 years in prison watching most of the guys I protected turn on me.
Jesus.
Yeah.
How much would you pay in that chemist, just out of curiosity?
He was getting paid on a per dosage basis. So he was making about $2.50 per dose.
So what does that equate to? I mean, I don't.
Okay, well, at 120 milligrams per dose, there's 8,000 doses in a kilo. So that means he's getting
16,000 a kilo, roughly.
No, 20,000
or 20,000. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Wow.
But we were wholesaling the material at that point anywhere from $10 to $12 per dose.
How do you obviously you just can't put an ad in the paper of what you're looking for. How do you come across a chemist to do that? How was the connection made for that?
One of the guys in Beverly Hills was a very unusual story because there aren't too many individuals from that social strata.
Yeah.
There's a lot of drug traffickers, but these are like rich kids playing bad boy.
I was about to say, because like to be that type of a chemist, you probably had to have some good schooling, good college, like probably making decent money, I would think.
Here's the thing about the chemist is, his name was Dr. Lester Friedman, and Les was in his 60s. He'd been through, he just retired chemist, been in academia and, private sector for 40 years. Okay. And he'd been through 2 divorces where he'd gotten wiped out.
There.
So now, here he is. Here's a guy in his 63, 64 years old who's dating a woman 30 years younger than him. Amber was 32, 33. And so, for me, at the time, when I was trained in the production of these compounds, I was 21 years old. So to me, she's just some old chick. She's in her 30s.
Yeah.
But to a 60-year-old, she's a hot young mama kind of a thing. And the thing about Amber is she was very high maintenance. Like she wanted her new Mercedes. She wanted her oceanfront condo. She wanted to go shopping in New York. She wanted to go to Washington and check out the pyramids in Egypt. Like it was a nightmare. He'd shut down the operation to go to Egypt for 2 weeks. Meanwhile, we got orders stockpiling up. But we could, we actually had a legitimate business where the chemist served as the front. You couldn't do what we were doing because we had tens of thousands of dollars worth of laboratory equipment. We literally had, government bureaucrats coming through our lab. You had fire marshals coming 4 times a year. You had all kinds of, environmental type regulatory issues to comply with. How are you storing your chemicals? How are you storing your waste? How are you treating your waste? Like they'd come through, I'd have to show them the solvent recovery systems. Well, if there's a 60-some-year-old chemist, they're not dealing with me. I'm just the lab assistant.
Yeah.
So we needed to have the chemist present to operate the lab. Because the front for the business was developing pesticides and, fertilizers for the local agricultural community. And so whenever he was around, we'd knock out the loads, but then he'd take off. He's got to take Amber to Rome, or he's got to take Amber to Egypt, or he's got to take Amber to Honolulu, or he's got to go to Denver to buy one of his daughters a car. And it was just like, it was a nightmare. And how we got to know the guy was, and understand, most of the individuals, when I actually use their names, they're deceased.
Right.
Like I don't mention individuals who weren't known to the authorities or aren't deceased or themselves haven't cooperated.
Yeah. I'd rather you not.
You know what I mean? Like I don't put people's business out there like that.
Yeah.
And now, of course, Les is, today he's in his 90s. He passed away.
Right.
And he was a business associate with an individual who himself has passed away, was the owner of a limousine company in Los Angeles. Well, back in the 80s, a rather unsophisticated but very effective way to launder money in the form of surfacing proceeds was the limousine business. Because you buy 4 or 5 limos, nobody knows whether or not the vehicle is out on the road. So you're just doing essentially phantom leases.
Yeah, I was about to say, how the hell would you do that? But that makes perfect sense. They
Yeah,
don't know how much you're
yeah,
actually using
that's
the
right. So
car.
you've got a fleet of 4 limos, and as far as this one got rented 16 times this month, this one 18 times this month. And so the limousine manufacturer, who even though he's deceased, I'm not going to say him,
Yeah.
had his company was tied in with a lot of drug traffickers because basically everybody knew if you're looking to buy a fleet of limos, go talk to Vinny.
Hmm.
And the individual who he had a business associate who knew the chemist.
Starting to make
And
a lot
so
more sense now.
so that's why so yeah, so that's how you ended up getting a group of guys. The leader of our group at the time was 26. I was 21. But the 26-year-old had bought limos from the guy. He knew a guy who knew a guy. Next thing you know, we're doing business with the 60-year-old.
Okay. Yeah, and that's another key component of this too, is being able to wash all this. It seems very much like the Mexican cartels learn from the Colombians and their mistakes, and were able to kind of, you know, take the basis of what they did, how they did it, but then make it better and a little bit more streamlined.
Once,
And
once,
what?
well, they say once the Mexicans took over distribution in the United States, the Colombian involvement ended in Acapulco.
Hmm.
They're just taking it to Acapulco. So they're getting paid Acapulco prices, and the Mexicans are getting the money to Colombia. By allowing the Mexicans to take over distribution, it allowed for movement of the money much easier. You didn't need highly sophisticated trade-based money laundering operations. All you do is put the money in a Camry and drive it to the border.
Yeah.
Now, on the Mexican side, it was very sophisticated. You have essentially an entire industry in Guadalajara who exists simply to surface capital. There are entire fields of businesses in Mexico that are designed simply to surface capital through phantom billing. So when you go to Cabo San Lucas and you see that fleet of fishing boats that American tourists rent to go deep sea fishing, those boats are out in the water every day. Some of them don't leave the dock for months. But they got two loads. They got a morning lease and they got a morning charter and an afternoon and an evening charter.
And you can put as many people as, I mean, or obviously
That's
a
right.
respectable number, but
Yep.
X person paid however many hundreds of dollars. It's really brilliant now that you
Yeah.
think about it,
You've
because
got, in
yeah.
Cabo San Lucas, you've got what's essentially considered Cabo is actually two different cities, Cabo San Lucas and San Jose de los Cabos, about 20 miles apart. So
Hmm.
you could be staying at one of the five-star resorts in San Jose Cabo, going to Cabo San Lucas. Well, everybody takes taxis. Nobody goes to Cabo and drives.
Right.
And so there were essentially fleets of taxis that never left the warehouse. But as far as the banks are concerned, there's 3 shifts a day where each taxi had 40 fares, taking gringos back and forth between the two cities. Party buses going from Cabo to La Paz. Every strip club, every nightclub, every restaurant, every photo company, the Americans go down there for weddings, catering meals, doing the photographs, barbers, nails, massages, you know, uh, dry cleaning. Every industry is essentially co-opted for the purposes of surfing capital.
Yeah.
Like one of my friends has an operation. He had a system. He had 300 strippers at a strip club who at the end of their shift were handed $500, go put the money in a bank account.
Having to show that they worked.
Because they're getting dollars. Why? Because they're entertaining gringos.
Right.
So the bank's not going to say anything suspicious. So at the end of a year, there's tens of millions of dollars in purchasing power just by these 300 women. So
Hmm.
then they say, hey, Veronica, you and Maria, go buy this condo. Cartel company owns the land. Cartel production company built the property. Cartel management company manages the property. And now they bring the capital in through the dancers. So
Wow.
they'll fill up the entire building in phantom purchases and then put it on the market. And when they sell, they sell. Meanwhile, all of this money is just churning.
And they're selling it probably at a higher like price point than it's actually bringing in, because you have the phantom sales
Yep.
to back it up that this business is doing X amount of dollars. And then Joe Blow, that has no idea this is going on,
Yep.
maybe just got a big inheritance or whatever. I'm going to buy this, and then he buys it, and he can't do squat with it because it doesn't have the same type of revenue.
The American tourist is a key element of the Mexican money laundering system, particularly like for Sinaloa, especially in my day, where they controlled the key assets: Puerto Vallarta, Cabo San Lucas, Mazatlan, Cancun. Well, that's enormous influx of Americans all bringing dollars. So if you've got a nightclub that holds 1,000 people and they all spend $200, that's 200,000. Well, you just double the amount. Here's 400,000 in cash, American dollars. This happens every day. If you go to Cabo, every Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, it's New Year's. It's packed. It's the same thing. Now, the same thing happens on a lesser scale here in the United States. Los Angeles has always been the money laundering capital of the United States.
Right.
But it's simply much more difficult. It's not the naked operations where you've got 200 taxis that never leave a warehouse and you're just billing.
Right.
In LA, you had a lot of nightclubs that were used.
I was about to say nightclub seems like it would be the key to go to up there, just because like in those clubs, you can put whatever price you want to on drinks or whatever. You can say you made thousands of dollars at the bar, because like I've been in places in New York, for example, where there's certain bars that I like to go to where you can get a shot and a beer for $6. And then there's other places you can go into, you can get one drink and it costs you 30.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you control that price, and then you can make your revenue be whatever you want.
Sure. Like I knew several guys that owned nightclubs, and phantom sales of alcohol was one of their key ways of surfacing their capital. And it's unfortunate because the guys that there's the phantom sales, and then one of the things that was developed through the Italians. Have you ever done any specials on a individual named Michael J. Peters? He's deceased. Peters was the individual out of Florida. He was associated with the Gambinos, and he went around establishing strip clubs.
Okay.
And so he also, of course, invited large drug traffickers to participate. There was $1 million minimum in 93 and 94 to buy in. And which in today's dollars would be about $2.5 million.
Right.
Okay. And the device he used was he would purchase companies that were bankrupt. So he would take over the tax loss credits. So then he would repurpose that company, open up a nightclub under it, and he'd be able to move money through the account at tax-free. You get to use up your tax loss credits before the government tries to encourage the businesses to rebound. So a company that fails, their tax loss credits are incredibly valuable for a money laundering operation. Also, from a nightclub perspective, you go in, first thing you do is you redecorate it, or technically referred to as tenant renovations. Well, you write off the tenant renovations over the course of the lease. And so you spend $300,000 renovating it, but on paper you spend $2 million. So you're going to be able to surface the capital through tenant renovations. You surface the capital through accumulated tax loss credits, in addition to the phantom sales. And then at the end of 3 years, you shut down the nightclub, close it down for 6 months, and then reopen it up again and start the entire operation all over. That's why in LA, there's so many nightclubs that only last for a couple, 2-3 years. Then they shut down.
And then reopen back up later on.
And then reopen back up.
Wow. Okay. There was a scenario that I heard in an episode that you done with our mutual friend, Matt Cox.
Okay.
And it was talking about a trip going to the zoo with a school bus. Can you break that down for me? Because I found that to be very, very interesting.
One of the individuals whom I became acquainted with in prison was a very large drug trafficker who was a Sinaloa individual. He was a little bit, how can I say this? The state of Tamaulipas is ground zero for the Gulf Cartel. It's just south of Texas. Reynosa is on the other side of Brownsville.
Right.
This is core Gulf territory. And at the time, the Zetas were the Gulf's military wing. Well, this individual was involved in moving a tremendous amount of product through Gulf Cartel territory. And he hadn't alerted them to the fact that it was actually Sinaloa product because the guy's wife was Chapo Guzman's cousin.
Mm.
And so here was somebody who had a family connection to Sinaloa, but who was from Tamaulipas. So he's bringing a tremendous amount of product into Texas through the Gulf plazas. The reason why he ended up getting, a 35-year sentence was his brother had created a system where they were importing multiple tons at a time using a smuggling system where, like those long light poles, the real big ones, like 30 feet long, somehow
Yeah.
higher. Well, they build them in Mexico, thanks to NAFTA. They construct them in Mexico and they bring them across the border. Well, what they would do is you got this huge 30-foot, 40-foot long piece of pipes, and they'll put like 4 of them on a truck and they stuff them in the middle. So it's like 3 or 4 tons per load.
Mm-hmm.
They get waved through, and they had Texas state troopers providing security. So they're paying for law enforcement escorts. So you've got a trooper in the front, a truck with the wide load truck right behind the trooper. Then you got the big rig transporting the pipes, and then you got another truck in the back, wide load, and then another trooper. So these were completely impenetrable. So they're going from Brownsville to Houston. Every one of these shipments is 3 tons. Well, when they get to Houston, they're going to take them up to Atlanta. And so they'd go from Houston to Corpus Christi, and then from Corpus Christi to Atlanta. Well, the way they would move the product in Corpus Christi is they had a fleet of modified school buses. And so they would literally lift the bus up off the carriage, put the material into the bus, close it, and then the bus would be used to move. And this is why it was particularly horrible. And when I talked to the guy, I'm like, what did the jury say? He said they wanted to kill him. He said every juror looked at him, they wanted to slice this guy's throat because the buses were being used to transport kids with special needs.
Oh, to the zoo?
So they would take him from Corpus Christi to the zoo, or they would take him from Corpus Christi, like on these field trips, where they would use school buses to transport the product. And so when the product would get to Atlanta, they drop off the kids at whatever festivities it is. Then they take it over to the shop, lift it up off the carriage, lift the carriage up off the frame, access the product, put it back down, send it back.
Yeah, because who's going to pull over and search a school bus full of special needs kids that are on their way to the zoo?
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, he said every juror at that moment looked like they wanted to just decapitate him.
Oh, yeah. Did they get caught doing that, or did that just come out after, like?
What happened is one of the loads ultimately were detected by the authorities. They let it through, and the guy in Atlanta had begun cooperating.
And so he said the guy in Atlanta, like one of the points of contacts up there that had something to do with
the guy that actually owned the shop was involved in his own trafficking activities. He got busted, so he tipped him off.
Hey, I'm doing this for these. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, because his best friend was the guy I met in prison. Like the guy in Atlanta was godfather to this guy's kid. Like they were very close. They were cuñados. And not cuñado, his compadre. And so the guy in Atlanta tips him off. So the authorities in Texas were waiting for him. They pull over the rig, access the light post. They find the 3 tons. And so that was what precipitated essentially the end. Because at that point, they knew how many loads had been done. So these guys had gotten, 40, 50, 60 tons in under law enforcement escort. And so they ultimately, and he made the mistake of, he had his mistress lived in Houston. And so he had made the mistake of crossing into this country to go visit his mistress, and they apprehended him.
Wow. The woman will get you every time. The downfall of most of these guys. Pete, this has been a great interview, man, but we are nowhere near done. Like there's so many, we could do a whole episode on money laundering from Mexico into the United States and all the fronts. You and I have had conversations about prominent club owners that have actually approached you about, controlling interest in certain clubs that we didn't even have a chance to really get into here today. Am I correct that you are starting your own YouTube channel?
Well, I'm in the process of getting permission to do so.
Okay.
Like I'm um, a production company has optioned the rights to my story.
Hmm.
And so right now I'm working with the producers as there's essentially two projects going on. And so I'm working with the producers, assisting them with respect to what's essentially pre-production. They got to interview all the people. They got to know this person's role. They got to, figure out who they're going to be able to involve themselves in.
Hmm.
And so I'm trying to get permission to do so because I would like to be able to develop content for other content creators. And so that's the direction that I'm going in because, quite frankly, I'm a little surprised that there's such an interest in these particular type of subject matters because, to me, when you come up in this world, when you're 20 years old, it's mundane.
Yeah. Well, you're used to it, and I think we had that conversation on the phone. You was like, I'm surprised there's such an interest, and we had this conversation. I feel it's prevalent, so I'll mention it here. There's a reason why, films like Blow is so popular. Films like The Godfather is regarded as the best, movie of all time. Sopranos, the best TV show, is because it's that criminal element, that organized crime, be it the mafia or the cartel. I think that thing just enthralls people, that subject matter. Obviously none of these people are ever going to live that life, but they are just so curious as to and I myself am one of them, so curious to the inner workings and how it's done and how it's played and how a kid, like you said, from the area where you grow up in, how do you get involved in all this?
Yeah.
Like just those steps, I think will always command viewership and views, and that's why you see these movies do so well, and even movies that don't necessarily do great box office numbers. Like I don't know if Blow was what I would consider like a box office success, but it's definitely regarded, I think, now as like a cult classic, and just
Okay.
that message. And I think you get that with this kind of storyline and subject matter. So definitely you would be an asset to anybody wanting to get a little bit more information on the cartels. And I'm really glad you could stop by and go over all this. And I'm definitely going to have you back on to go over some more stuff. Are you allowed on social media? Do you have social media right now? What do you
I
stand?
have just recently been allowed to begin using social media.
Okay. So
And
do you
so
want to shout out like anything of where people can contact you, or I'll
no,
leave that up to you?
perhaps next time when
Okay.
so I'm currently in the process of for finalizing getting all the necessary authorization
I
and
got
then building the correct structure. Like
you.
I'm not impulsive. I think things through before.
Well, definitely, like you just got out of a long prison stint, man. So there's a lot of things that you need to make sure that doesn't do anything to jam you up in any way. So cross your T's, dot your I's, and we'll definitely sit back down. But Pete, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate you coming on and just giving us just a little. We've just kind of scratched the surface here. We
Sure.
can definitely do a lot more with this, but I kind of wanted to just give a little background on who you were, kind of lay the landscape, and then maybe next time we get together we can go a little bit more into detail about how these money laundering operations work from in the cartels to the United States, who some of the players are, and just I think there's a lot of ground to be covered here.
Well, recently there's been a lot of talk about the Chinese, and that is something that I do have quite a bit of knowledge about because one of the principal groups that I did business with were Chinese. Los Angeles, we had a number of triads that are present. And so the players have changed, but the
Mhm.
operations haven't.
And I mean,
And so
just
the
your prison term in and of itself would be worthy of probably 2 episodes, because you spent some prison time with some pretty notorious guys in prison. One of them, I think, was a pretty prominent mafia guy from Philadelphia, right, John?
yep, John Stanford was my cellmate. My good,
Wow.
he and I became very close. Really good. I mean, look, whatever John did on the street, he did on the street.
Right.
I know from my interactions with him, very thoughtful, very considerate. Like went way out of his way because he's the one that helped me get situated in prison. I started off at the maximum security level. It wasn't until 15 years later that I ended up at Coleman Low, where I became acquainted with Matt. And so
Hmm.
I started out at a very serious, security level where, fortunately, John and some other individuals were there to kind of take me under their wing, make sure, hey, look, this is how things are ran, this is how it's operated. Although I'm Latino, I'm Brazilian of Italian descent. And so I was accepted by the Italian car. And at the maximum security level, the Italians and the Israelis run together.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when I got there were 17 guys. I was the 18th.
Okay.
And unlike all of the other guys, I was the one guy that wasn't, organized crime.
Yeah.
I knew guys on the street. I knew Italians in Vegas. I knew the Israelis in Beverly Hills. I knew the Chinese. But I myself wasn't from that world. I was just a trafficker. And so they went out of all those guys went out of their way. The one who started teaching me how to do legal work, walked me through the process, spent a couple of years going out of his way to really invest the time to help me. He was a hitter for the Gambinos,
Yeah.
a life sentence. These are, the guy that took me around, introduced me to Mario and a lot of the good guys. He was an Italian guy from the Hells Angels. And so you'd be surprised at how many good people there are in prison who just made mistakes. I'm not excusing their conduct. I'm not excusing my own conduct.
Right.
I did 25 years in prison, and it is what it is. I
Yeah.
could have cut my sentence much shorter. Like I said, I made the mistake of not taking the opportunity when it was given. Believe me, if it was 1997, I wouldn't hesitate to cut all their throats. And so when I speak with individuals, I don't present a romantic view.
Right.
We're flawed individuals. We made the mistakes we made. We learn, we are the individuals we are today because of the mistakes we made in our youth and the lessons we drawn from them. And today I'm in a position to provide some very painful lessons.
Yeah. And that's good. I mean, people need to hear that, because I think that's probably the most important thing you get from this. People see, the good side of it, the glamour, the money, the nice cars, the women or whatever, but there very much is a dark side to that. And that's where stories like yours come in that are, prevalent, because you, like you said, you went in, what, 97, you just got out. I mean, that's a long
Yeah,
time. And I don't think anybody there's no amount of money in the world, no hot enough chick in the world that I could
yeah,
have for a short amount of time that I could say, okay, I'll go do that many years in prison. It's just not happening.
that's right.
And I can deal with I kind of coincide with what you said too about, you have relationships with some of these individuals, and maybe somebody, side-eyed you because they, went to prison for killing people or whatever the case may be. I've had that. I've met with people. I've, had dinner, and everybody's like, well, doesn't it make, I was like, I didn't meet him in that context. Like, he's not a mobster anymore. He's, that part of his life is behind him. So I didn't meet that version of him. And I met that version of him. Yeah, I might've been a little afraid, but I met a guy that's no longer part of that life. Kind of
Sure,
like you would Stanford. Stanford's in prison. You met the guy that you met in prison, not the guy on the street. It's two
sure.
different people.
Yeah. Like I said, I've had good experience with pretty much all of the organized crime guys, within the Italian cars.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, same, most of the cartel guys, you know, none of those people are gangster, or how can I say this? There are no gang members operating at that level.
Right. Yeah.
If I saw
It's,
somebody with gold teeth, you're not talking to me.
yeah.
If you're claiming to be a blood or a crip or a set, I don't get involved in that silliness. Like, I have no time for that. Even in prison, I don't play the racial game. I'm not on that time, which was why, I've always had the benefit of kind of falling in between the cracks. Like, I was a member of the Italian car, but I wasn't a mobster, so I wasn't involved in any of the internal dynamics.
But
You
you were
know,
able to reap the benefits that that
yes,
provided.
well, I'm sitting at the table, I'm at the movie theater, we're at the bocce court, but I don't get caught up in the drama. Same thing on the Latino side. Although I'm Latino, I'm not Mexican.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I'm invited to all of the little festivities, but I'm not part of the car. So I get the benefits without all of the drama. And
That's
so,
definitely going to be the next episode we do, is just how you were able to kind of circumvent and navigate that through your prison sentence. Cause I think that's very unique of how not everybody has that, heritage to be able to pull that off. So that's definitely a unique story.
well, and then of course, once you achieve a measure of success litigating cases on behalf of other individuals, all of a sudden, everybody has an interest in making sure you don't have a problem.
Yeah, that makes sense too. And that's another layer of it, is you did become a very prolific, what is the term, jailhouse lawyer? Is that what they classify that as?
You know, that's, I did it basically. Well, you have to understand, I didn't understand how I ended up with a 40-year sentence And, not to delve into specifics too deeply, but, I got charged in connection with a shooting.
Hmm.
The individual wasn't shot.
Yeah, it's hard to do that.
You know what I
Be-
mean? I know what it's like to have a false charge based on fabricated evidence.
As do I.
You know what I'm saying? And so that's where, so when I got to the prison, I'm like, unfortunately, one of the Italian guys, he only knew about 30%. What 30% of what he said was correct.
Hmm.
But if you're starting from zero, that's an enormous leg up. And, it built from there. And so by the time 6 or 7 years came into this situation, I had begun doing cases for other individuals, and we can talk about it. Like later on, we'll discuss it. First
Yeah.
guy I got relief for was a mob guy out of Connecticut who they enhanced his sentence on a homicide. Who turns out the guy wasn't, the victim wasn't killed. The victim got arrested in a bank robbery out of Rhode Island. So, that was an easy win essentially. But
That'll throw a monkey wrench into the case for sure.
well, and so that's, the guy went from a 20 piece on a RICO conspiracy to 6 years on a bookmaking operation. Like I'm not the guy you come to if you want to go from 30 years to time served. I'm the
Right.
guy that comes from 30 to 17.
Yeah.
And as
And,
long as, and yes, there are plenty of stories involving numerous
and that's
cases.
still good numbers to get off in there. That's a lifetime when you're behind those walls. So,
Absolutely.
Pete, I can't tell you how much I enjoyed you coming on the show, my brother. I can't wait till next time.
No
So
problem.
hopefully next time we'll have a little bit more stuff set up for social media where people can go follow you. But again, 1,000 thank yous for coming on the show, my friend.
No problem. And I do want to congratulate you. I saw the podcast episode that you did with the Inside True Crime. You guys are what, over 600,000 views now?
Yeah, it's last time I looked, it was like 650 ish. So closing
Wow.
in on 700,000.
Very impressive.
So yeah, great.
That was a
Thank
great dialogue.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully. And we'll probably touch on some of the stuff with P. Diddy, you and I in a later episode because there's a lot of interesting stuff that's going to come out of that case. So
Certainly.
we'll definitely touch on that. And I can't wait to have you back. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Crime and Entertainment. Pete, we'll see you next time, my friend.